So that will make tensions grow in those societies?
Well, it means that people that are not part of the dominant ethnic group are not, going to be full citizens and not full. I think that immigration basically is necessary. It's very hard to avoid in the modern world, but it really works only if immigrants eventually come to feel like they're part of the society into which they've moved. And it goes both ways. Some of them resist being integrated, but sometimes the societies themselves push them away because they say, you're not the right skin color or whatnot. And I think that in a modern democratic society is really not the
With those remarks, we covered some of your critique of the right wing today, but you have a critique as well of the left wing kind of identity politics. And your message for them is that we cannot build societies on diversity or multiculturalism. Why
well,
not?
I think that it depends on the definition. If you say that we have to treat people as groups, as cultures, and respect the groups, it's problematic because in a liberal society we're committed to certain values like individual rights. And if you have a cultural group that doesn't respect the rights of women or gays or other people that are part of the community, then that's a conflict between the dominant values of the society and that particular culture. And I think that's the kind of conflict that's existed in Europe for some time. I think we need to get back to, first of all, an identity that's not based on these narrow characteristics, especially ones that are built on biology, like your race or ethnicity or gender. I think we need to create more political identities that are more inclusive, that will actually accept people, in the actual diversity they exist in the society.
I think it's fair to say that in your book you have a warning for these identity politicians, that if we go on this way, we will be doomed. That's a word you use in the book. And you also say that if we want to know where identity politics will end, we have to look to the Middle East.
That's absolutely right. So the Middle East is a region in which Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia, Libya, Yemen, all of these countries have fallen apart in the last decade or two. And I think the reason they've fallen apart is that there's no overarching sense of national identity. In a place like Syria, Bashar Assad wants to defend his narrow Alawite community at the expense of everybody else, and you can't have a country under those circumstances. And so I think it is a warning to everybody about what out-of-control identity politics can lead to.
But do you see European countries heading that way?
They will head that way if you have further polarization and if you have minority communities that live parallel lives without ultimately integrating into the larger society. It's a ways away, but I think, this is the moment at which we have to think carefully about, the basis, the social basis for a democracy.
And you have actually some solutions or suggestions what should be done dealing with this identity challenge. You make the point that we need broader identities. You mentioned that already. And you also talk about creedal identities.
Yes.
What is really the challenge?
Well, so traditional identities were in fact built around ethnicity and religion. And given the actual diversity of societies, that's not going to work. And so I think you have to have a identity that's really based around ideas, around common commitment to, let's say, Enlightenment values, to values of equality, rule of law, constitutional government, this sort of thing. That has to be the building block for a modern democratic identity.
And could you give just a small hint what this would imply for a country like Denmark?
Well, Denmark, like a number of countries in continental Europe, for example, has had an argument over citizenship and what citizenship ought to entail. It's I think, appropriate to have a citizenship based on knowledge of the country's history and language and things of that sort. But it also needs to be open to people so that, if you really do want to join the national community, you can, even though you don't look like a white European Dane. I think that's very important.
So we should not, by the simple idea of the state and the way we talk about being Danish, exclude certain groups. That's one point. On the other hand, you point to assimilation.
Assimilation, yeah.
As a way forward for dealing with the immigration issue.
Well, generally speaking, it doesn't happen in the first generation, but by the second generation, you know, people should speak the language, should be able to get jobs in the, you know, in the economy because they, you know, they are part of the culture. I think, frankly, intermarriage is also an important aspect of integration because that's ultimately the way that you know, groups become part of the larger society.
So does assimilation mean that, for instance, people living in Denmark as citizens, they should accept the equality of gender, the way we're thinking about this in Denmark, that they should adopt the Danish way of life?
I think that it depends on what you mean by the Danish way of life. Something like female equality is not just a Danish cultural characteristic. This is something that I think is, you know, absolutely basic to any liberal democracy that treats its citizens as individuals, including all of its female citizens. And if you don't accept something like that, I don't think that you can really be part of the national community. So I think we have to be clear. There are some things, you know, like religion or, I don't know, maybe food, where it's been part of the culture historically, but it can't be the basis of unity in the future. But something like the principle of individual rights and individual equality, I think, has to be.
You recommend countries to work along the lines of broader identities, yes, and creedal identities. Who do you see doing that, countries or political leaders in the world currently?
Well, I would have said the leading candidate would have been someone like Emmanuel Macron in France, who was elected based on a new party that was going to give France a new effort at reform. Unfortunately, right now he's fallen to very, you know, he's created a lot of opposition for himself. But it has to be, I think, based on some liberal idea like that, that's the only way that an actual diverse society is going to be able to work together.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Ja, her siger jeg tak for i aften og på gensyn.